The instant my humanity ended is burned into what's left of my mind. It wasn't the scalpel biting into my scalp, or the stink of my own flesh as they burned pathways through bone. It wasn't even the icy pressure of the cortical inhibitors sliding into the soft meat of my frontal lobe. What stayed with me was something far smaller. I remember the final thought that belonged entirely to me. It was about the color blue. There was a servitor in the Medicaid bay where they staged us for processing. She had been an elderly woman once, before they hollowed her out and filled her with metal. Cables threaded through her empty eye sockets, piston assemblies jutting where arms should have been. She moved back and forth over the same 3 tiles of flooring, scrubbing in that monotonous, unending loop. Back and forth, for what might have been hours or years. Her skin looked like brittle parchment stretched over the steel cage that served as a rib cage now. But what caught me was her robe. By the throne, that robe. It was blue. Not the proud midnight of an ultramarine's plate, not the harsh electric flash of a plasma vent, but a gentle, washed-out blue. Like a summer sky on some long-forgotten agri world. It was the sort of blue that makes you think of home, of being a child, of days when the galaxy felt like a wide, mysterious place instead of an endless machine that grinds you down. I stared at that patch of cloth while the tech adepts arranged their instruments around me. I thought about how absurdly beautiful it was, how impossible it seemed that something so soft, so harmless, could exist in a chamber dedicated to mutilation. It reminded me of my sister's favorite dress, the one she wore on Throne Day Mass, the one that made her look as if she'd stolen a piece of the sky and draped it over her shoulders. That was my final, untainted human thought, a simple recognition of beauty, valued for nothing more than itself, untouched by function, usefulness, or the relentless logic that would soon replace everything I'd been. They told us the lobotomization doesn't begin with the scalpels. It starts long before, in the gaps between the drugs and the dampeners, during those thin slivers of awareness they still permit. A tech priest with a voice like grinding gears laid it out as if reciting a data sheet. The mind must be softened first, he said, yielded, made ready. They begin with isolation. You are locked in a sensory deprivation cell that strips away every reference point that says, I am human. No light, no sound, no touch apart from the cold bite of the restraint harness you're bolted into. Time unravels. Minutes stretch into hours, hours into days, days into something that feels like centuries. Your heartbeat becomes a drumbeat that fills the void. Your own breathing roars in your ears like a storm. The rush of blood through your veins swells into a private orchestra of panic. Then the next phase begins. Conditioning. High Gothic litanies to the Omnissiah and the Emperor, stitched with machine prayers, are played at frequencies your waking mind can't quite register. Your sleeping brain drinks them in anyway. New words, new pathways. Obedience, efficiency, the sacred union of flesh and steel, the holy simplicity of doing as you are told. They feed you barely enough to sustain life, never enough to grant clarity. Thin gruel laced with neural suppressants, water that tastes faintly of rust and electricity. Slowly, your body forgets what it means to feel full, or warm, or at ease. You become nothing more than a waiting container, an empty shell anticipating the moment it will be filled with purpose. At the beginning, I resisted. All of us did. The human mind clings stubbornly to itself, even when it's being systematically dismantled. I clutched my memories like contraband gems, turning them over and over in the endless dark. My name, my home, my mother's face, wet with tears as the Arbites dragged me away for daring to question a governor's grain quotas. Marcus. My name was Marcus Vex, of Hiveworld Terrors Prime, subsector Ultima Segmentum Solar, Hab Block 7.7, Level 85, Compartment 4471. I worked in nutrient processing, 12 hours a shift, 6 days a week. 40 years of dutiful labor for the throne. I had once had a wife, before the consumption claimed her. No children by the Emperor's mercy, though we tried for years. Those facts became my rosary, my lifeline. I recited them constantly, like a catechism, like a drowning man whispering his own name, to hold myself together against the storm stripping my mind apart. But memory is brittle, and the servants of the machine god are nothing if not thorough. Every day brought new vials of chemicals, new procedures, deeper intrusions into the sanctity of thought. They traced my neural pathways with instruments that felt like ice picks driven straight into my cortex. They catalogued me. Fear, hope, love, every attachment, every dream, every private shame. Each one flagged on some invisible data slate for editing, deletion, or repurposing. I discovered that I wasn't alone in this fate. The conditioning block contained row after row of cells, each with a prisoner strapped down just like me. Men and women from half a dozen worlds, all guilty of the same ultimate failure. We had not served the Imperium with enough fanaticism. We had doubted. We had hesitated. We had shown mercy where cruelty was expected, independence where obedience was demanded. The woman in the cell beside me had been a scholar instructor on an agri-world. She refused to include approved texts teaching children how to inform on their parents for supposed thought crimes. The man across the corridor had overseen a manufactorum line and dared to complain about conditions that killed 3 workers a day. Another had been a humble scribe who accidentally logged casualty figures that did not match the glorious victories printed in the official records. Petty infractions, human failings, small acts of conscience that marked us as unsuitable for regular imperial service, but not so corrupt as to merit a last bolt to the head. We were scrapped to be melted down and cast anew, flesh to be repurposed, brains to be redrafted into something more useful. The same tech adept with the rasping voice came to each of us, his tone as dry and impersonal as if he were reading from a maintenance log. We would become servitors, he said. We would serve the Omnissiah and the Emperor with flawless loyalty, flawless efficiency, and flawless emptiness. Our bodies would be rebuilt as required, neural jacks, mechadendrites, augmetic limbs, organ replacements, whatever our future tasks demanded. Our thoughts would be pared down to the barest minimum. Anything that might interfere with function would be excised. Fear, affection, ambition, curiosity, the capacity to truly suffer or rejoice, or to feel anything more nuanced than simple go-no-go responses to instructions. We would be made into tools, living instruments, endowed with only enough awareness to follow intricate orders and nothing more. Hunger, thirst, and pain would become irrelevant, regulated by routines and fail-safes. We would never again feel loneliness or heartbreak or the desperate yearning for something more. Choice, moral doubt, the crushing weight of personal responsibility, those torments would be lifted from us. It was, he claimed, an act of mercy, a kindness granted to those too frail to serve the Imperium as fully human beings. As he spoke, his augmetic jaw clicked with each measured syllable. I caught myself wondering who he had been before the metal. Whether some remnant of that man still persisted, buried beneath the machinery and decades of conditioning. Did he remember what it was like to be afraid, to hesitate, to secretly wish for a better life than endless servitude to cogitators and cooling units? His red optics locked on to me with the precision of a targeting array. I heard the faint hiss of his respirator and the low hum of the cogitator nests feeding him data before he chose his words. You speculate on whether I retain any vestige of my initial humanity, he said. There was no hint of amusement, no trace of irritation, just flat statement. This query is common among subjects awaiting conversion. The answer is layered. He tilted his head, servos whining faintly as he repositioned. I retain my birth name. I recall fragmented sequences from my pre-augmentation existence. These memories serve a function. They provide context, facilitate interaction with baseline humans. They are preserved for utility, not sentiment. The twin crimson lenses of his optical array never blinked. You fear the dissolution of the self. Your error lies in your definition of self. You imagine consciousness as a sacred flame. In reality, it is a pattern, electrical currents, biochemical cascades, synaptic architectures, all of which can be charted, adjusted, and enhanced. What you call humanity is merely inefficiency, noise, glorious randomness that prevents optimal performance. He leaned closer to my restraints, close enough that I could smell the machine oil in his joints and the faint ozone halo of his power systems. Once your conversion is complete, comprehension will follow. The fears that presently consume you will become as trivial as childhood phantoms. You will be refined, completed, released from the torment of autonomous cognition. I longed to curse him, to spit my hatred in his face, but the neural dampeners had throttled my emotions down to dull echoes. Instead, a different question forced its way through my numbed lips. "How many?" I mumbled, tongue thick and clumsy. "How many have you processed?" His augmetic fingers tapped his thigh with metronomic precision while he calculated. "During my assignment to this facility, I have overseen the conversion of approximately 47,312 individuals. All have been successfully redeployed to appropriate functions. All have attained serenity in directed labor. 47,000. The number slammed into me like a hammer blow. I could almost feel it spreading through my thoughts, freezing everything it touched. 47,000 erased identities. 47,000 souls repurposed as discrete cogs in the Imperial engine. 47,000 people who had once laughed and wept and dreamed, now moving along fixed paths like walking machinery. "Where do they go?" I asked. "What happens after?" "They serve," he answered, as if that should have been obvious. "Industrial units, maintenance assets, data management platforms, Skitarii adjuncts, and numerous other categories, assigned according to their physical and cognitive profiles. They continue to serve until their organic systems fail. At that point, remaining components are reclaimed. Biological matter is processed. Mechanical elements are refurbished and integrated into new subjects. System efficiency is preserved. Nothing is squandered." The cold perfection of it had a terrible elegance, a seamless cycle optimized for output and devoid of waste. Human beings broken down into raw material, sorted into flesh and steel, and reallocated according to the Adeptus Mechanicus's models. Even in death, we would remain part of the machine. I closed my eyes and tried to project myself forward 50 years. I pictured myself standing at some assembly line or in some endless storage hall, repeating a single motion again and again, with no memory of Marcus Vex, no hint of what had been taken from me. A ghost animating a frame of metal and meat, granted just enough awareness to execute instructions, but not enough to suffer. Would there be dreams? Would some fragment of Marcus still lurk in the depths, walled off behind inhibitor fields and cortical locks, screaming silently for an eternity? Or would the process be absolute, a final erasure so total that nothing remained except autonomic systems and programmed routines? My thoughts drifted back to the servitor with the blue robe, endlessly scrubbing the same 3 squares of floor. Did she retain any memory of the path that had led her there? Did she rise from her recharge cradle with some faint sense that she had once been more than a cleaning unit? Or had they truly hollowed her out completely, granting her the perfect emptiness the tech adept praised? The days dissolved into a chemical haze. Starvation, drugs, and suppressors gnawed away at my body and mind. My muscles wasted under the restraints. My thoughts grew slow and disjointed. Emotions faded to weak static, little more than background noise. New prisoners were brought in from time to time, thrashing and begging and cursing in ways that felt strangely familiar, like watching actors reenact a play I vaguely remembered. I observed them with a distant, clinical interest and realized with a spike of cold dread that empathy was already slipping away from me. The compounds they pumped through my veins did their work without mercy, rewiring my brain, shutting down circuits linked to independent judgment and deep feeling. One cycle, as I lay in the dark, listening to a new arrival sobbing in a nearby cell, I discovered I could no longer summon the image of my wife's face. I knew as a fact that I had been married once. I knew she had died. I could recite those details like a line in a report, but the warmth, the grief, the weight of her absence, those had been cut away. She was nothing more than an entry in a ledger I'd never read. The realization should have shattered me. Instead, I noted it with mild concern, the way one might notice misplacing a small tool. It was unfortunate, but not painful. In that moment, I finally understood what the tech adept meant by peace in servitude. They were amputating the pain of existence itself, leaving behind only the quiet satisfaction of function fulfilled. I was being remade into something that could labor without suffering, obey without doubt, persist without the crushing pressures of hope, fear, or love. By the time they wheeled me into the operating chamber, the final act almost felt redundant. The theater smelled of incense and sacred machine oil. Hooded tech priests glided around me with ritualistic precision. Cherubim drones fluttered overhead, their artificial wings beating in rhythm as they chanted pre-recorded hymns to the Omnissiah. The injector's bite at my neck was sharp and cold. The ceiling wavered as the anesthetic flooded my system. Somewhere beyond the haze, I heard bone saws spin up in the low murmur of the canticle of blessed modification. My last coherent thought was a scrap of catechism from my childhood. The Emperor protects, but he did not protect me from this. Not from the patient, meticulous dismantling of everything that made me a person. When awareness returned, the universe was different. Lines were sharper, angles truer. Every surface seemed to arrange itself into clean geometry, every sound slotted into ordered categories. The pain was gone, both the raw physical misery and the deeper, older ache of a life spent in fear and doubt. My first clear sensation was not happiness, but alignment. Not joy, but a profound sense that I was exactly what I was meant to be. I was a tool. Tools do not anguish. They function. My vision teemed with information, augmented overlays, scrolling temperature data, material compositions, structural stress readouts. Icons marked the positions and task status of other servitors in the vicinity. The world had been reduced to streams of numbers and symbols my altered mind interpreted without effort. I stood in a vast workshop, lit dimly by lumen strips and shrine lamps, alive with a roar of machinery and the distant drone of tech priests intoning prayers. Conveyor belts rolled endless lines of components through the bay. Servitors at each station moved with exacting rhythm, assembling, welding, cutting, testing. The air carried the tang of metal shavings, ozone, and sacred unguents. My own body felt heavier, more stable. Looking down, I saw that my arms had been replaced with multi-jointed mechanical manipulators. Each limb housed an assortment of built-in instruments, welders, cutters, fine tolerance grips, micro-assembly tools, everything required for my function as a manufacturing unit. The changes went far deeper than that. My nervous system had been rerouted and tuned for precision. Old muscle memories were gone, overwritten with flawless recall of assembly schematics, inspection routines, and efficiency protocols. I possessed expertise I'd never studied, comprehension of processes I had never seen. Knowledge had been poured into my brain like molten metal into a mold. The greatest alteration, though, was in how I thought. The chaotic tangle that had once been human consciousness was now a streamlined flow. I still computed, still made decisions, but only inside tightly defined parameters related to my assigned role. The urge to question authority, the aching concern for others, the flashes of creativity that had once pushed me to imagine better ways, those were simply absent. Their absence did not trouble me. They were inefficiencies, sources of error and delay, the very qualities that had marked me as defective in the eyes of the Imperium. Without them, I could devote myself wholly to my tasks. A tech priest approached my station, sensors sweeping across the metrics floating in my vision. A faint pulse of approval registered as my performance exceeded baseline by 12%, with no errors and ideal power consumption. "Unit Gamma 77, he intoned, his voice carrying the weight of the Omnissiah's will. "You are reassigned to Manufacturing Bay Delta for specialized duties. Present yourself to Tech Adept 14 for refitting and directive update," I acknowledged with a single, precise nod. Subroutines spun up. I initiated shutdown of my current station, transferring control to a standby unit. There was no fear, no regret, no lingering sense of loss. There was only the next task in the sequence, waiting to be executed. The handover itself required no effort on my part. One subroutine ended, another initialized, and I moved. My re-engineered brain plotted the most efficient route through the Manufactorum, while augmetic legs carried me along it with tireless, unerring steps. There was no hesitation, no weighing of options, only execution. The passageways were crowded with others like me. Servitors marching in precise patterns, each one locked into their designated task. We passed one another without so much as a glance. No greetings, no curiosity, no impulse to connect. We were not companions. We were machine parts, each slotted into a position within the greater mechanism of the facility. Somewhere in the depths of my mind, a dormant fragment tried to recall what it felt like to want anything, to long for praise, for friendship, for something more than the quiet satisfaction of a job completed. Those memories still existed, archived in inaccessible mental vaults, but the feelings attached to them were gone. They were bare facts now, no more meaningful than a random planetary weather report. Tech Adept Valeth awaited me in Manufacturing Bay Delta, a chamber far larger than the one I just left. The air vibrated with more intense energies, and I registered servitors working on intricate assembly lines. By the iconography and seal-stamped purity wards, I identified the output immediately. Munitions and weapon components, crafted under strict Mechanicus rites. "Gamma 77, Valeth said, his voice carrying a faint upward inflection that my processors flagged as approval. "Performance metrics indicate you are suited for advanced fabrication protocols. You are reassigned to the manufacture of sanctified bolter munitions for Astartes forces operating in this sector." The importance of this role lit up my consciousness like a devotional candle. To fashion ammunition for the Emperor's angels of death, to help arm them against heretic and Xenos alike, that was an honor beyond any I could have conceived as Marcus Vex. Within the narrow emotional range that remained to me, something like pride flickered. Valeth guided me to a station fitted with molecular forges and ultrafine assembly units capable of shaping bolter shells with nanometric precision. The work sequences were complex, involving constant adjustment to environmental conditions, exact control of material purity, and strict adherence to prescribed machine prayers. Every round required benedictions, microscopic script work of litanies, and exhaustive testing to ensure it would fly true from an Astartes weapon. The tasks filled my entire awareness. Hours collapsed into moments as I sank into the seamless rhythm of production. Feed in raw stock, align and calibrate the molecular forge, initiate form casting, track the union of sacred metal and explosive core, etch the ordained sigils, seal with final blessings. Repeat, each shell a mirror of the last, each one a tiny offering laid at the feet of the Emperor. I never felt weary, never craved diversion or rest. My upgraded frame had been purged of such failings. My optics corrected for microscopic irregularities in real time. My mechadendrite hands made adjustments beyond any human's capability. My cogitator-augmented brain computed error margins and throughput ratios with the speed and reliability of an actual machine spirit. This was the promise the tech adept had spoken of made real. Deliverance from the turmoil of human life, replaced by the tranquil clarity of single-minded service. My existence became a continuous act of contemplation, my awareness narrowed to the sacred task of forging weapons for the Emperor's war. No doubts, no moral dilemmas, no sense of the galaxy outside these walls. Only function. Yet in the infinitesimal gaps between one set of instructions and the next, something else would sometimes rise from the depths. A sliver of sensation, a wisp of recollection, a faint echo of the man I'd been. It lasted only moments, barely detectable even to my enhanced awareness, like a distant star briefly visible through smog. One color, blue. Occasionally, in the pale halo of the work lamps, I registered a trace of that hue. Just a suggestion, a tone that didn't quite match the standard lumen output. It stirred dormant regions of my cortex, sparking neural patterns with no obvious connection to current tasks. The anomaly persisted for only milliseconds before my behavioral safeguards crushed it back into silence. But within those tiny fragments of time, something close to yearning flickered. I could not have said what I longed for. The memory had been too heavily edited, the context too thoroughly excised. Still, the feeling lingered, a hairline fracture in the perfect mechanism of my remade mind, proof that some shard of Marcus Vex still clung to existence. I dutifully reported these irregularities to Tech Adept Valeth during my scheduled maintenance audit. Efficiency demanded absolute transparency regarding any deviation from optimal performance, and I experienced the familiar satisfaction of obeying protocol. Detail the character of these aberrant thought patterns, Valeth instructed, his lenses centering on my cranial ports. Brief episodes of non-functional neural excitation triggered by specific visual inputs, I responded. Duration approximately 0.03 of a second. Occurrence intermittent but trending upward. No measurable degradation of output or task completion. Valath's augmetic fingers tapped a precise rhythm against his thigh as he processed the report. Color-linked memory echoes, he concluded, common in subjects with strong pre-conversion emotional bindings, indicative of incomplete restructuring in hippocampal regions. He moved to his cogitator node and began entering commands. Recommendation: immediate corrective procedure, deep memory excision and reinforcement of behavioral conditioning. I accepted this verdict with what I recognized as gratitude. These mental fluctuations had no practical use and posed a hypothetical threat to future efficiency. Their removal would refine me further, making me a more perfect instrument of the Omnissiah's will, purged of the last weak remnants of baseline humanity. And yet, as I prepared to undergo the procedure, that faint echo of blue seemed to flare brighter at the center of my awareness. Without understanding why, I found myself silently wishing that the tech priests would miss it, that some tiny corner of Marcus Vex might endure even this final round of cutting and burning. The thought was irrational, disloyal, a direct violation of the logic chains that governed my new existence. By rights, I should have flagged it as an urgent fault condition and submitted to immediate reconditioning. Instead, I buried it as deeply as I could, sealing it behind layers of operational routines, and returned to my station, continuing to shape bolter shells with flawless precision, while a forbidden part of me watched the glow of the lamps and silently remembered what blue had once meant. The deep memory excision was booked for my next maintenance cycle. But the Emperor, or chance, intervened. A priority override surged through the facility's control network, reassigning every manufactorum resource to an emergency ordnance request. The Crimson Fists chapter was embroiled in a vast engagement against an Orc Wa in a nearby subsector, and their demand for sanctified bolter rounds outpaced even their own forged ships' capabilities. Tech Adept Valeth relayed the new directive with his usual clinical calm. Corrective surgery suspended, all capacity diverted to priority ammunition output. Your irregularities remain acceptable under current operational constraints. Something within me loosened. An internal shift I identified after a moment as relief, though the emotional vocabulary to fully name it no longer existed. The delay meant that the fragment calling itself Marcus Vex would survive a little longer, hidden in the depths beneath Gamma 77's efficient obedience. The emergency production cycle that followed dwarfed anything I'd experienced since conversion. The facility ran at peak throughput for weeks without pause. Every servitor labored at the edge of its design limits. The entire complex thrummed with constant motion and the rhythmic thunder of machinery. It was a hymn to the Omnissiah, sung in kinetic energy and spent fuel. My personal output climbed by 37% as I integrated new optimization routines and stripped away every redundant movement from my workflow. Each finished bolter round that passed through my manipulators was a prayer cast in metal, a physical expression of the Emperor's wrath that would soon be loaded into Astartes magazines. Within the framework of my conditioning, the work was sublime, pure, directed, and utterly purposeful. Yet the hidden Marcus watched in growing dread. Those shells would kill. They would blast apart orcs and traitors, yes, but also strike Imperial citizens, by chance, by misfire, by misidentification. No war left only enemies in its wake. Each flawless round would eventually punch through armor, flesh and bone, ending lives that had once carried the same fragile mix of fear and hope that I had known before the surgeons cut it all away. The servitor I had become understood that such deaths were acceptable costs, that the Imperium's survival outweighed individual suffering, but the ghost behind my eyes recoiled, horrified that I was now an integral component of that killing apparatus. I struggled to drown those thoughts in the sanctity of my duty, to frame my efforts purely as contributions to the Emperor's grand design. But the questions persisted, gaining strength each cycle. I started to register details my servitor mind should have ignored. The volume of scrap, the energy expenditure, the sheer scale of resources devoted to feeding this endless war machine. Hundreds of tons of raw material flowed through the facility every day, emerging as floods of bolter shells, plasma charges, las power cells, and countless other lethal instruments. The statistics were precise, even beautiful in their symmetry, yet the implications gnawed at me. Running a simple computation, I determined that over the course of my service I had produced roughly 43,000 bolter rounds. Factoring in standard Astartes accuracy and typical engagement data, I estimated my contribution to total battlefield fatalities at around 15,000 sentient beings, and not all of them were enemies. Analysis of Imperial combat records suggested at least 12% would have been loyal civilians caught in crossfire or falsely identified as hostiles. 1,800 innocents, workers, children, the elderly, snuffed out by munitions my hands had helped shape. The figure seared itself into my awareness, corroding the placid certainty that had defined my post-conversion existence. I tried to nest it inside the familiar rhetoric of sacrifice and necessity. The equations refused to soften. 1,800 people who had likely done nothing worse than stand in the wrong place when a trigger was pulled. Each one someone's family, someone's solace. Each death sending out waves of anguish into already fractured communities. The sheer volume of suffering exceeded what my modified mind was designed to process. What had once been proof of my excellence, my immaculate precision and output, now looked to the hidden Marcus like the quiet efficiency of mass murder. Without meaning to, I began to pause in my cycle, microsecond hesitations when my hands hovered over a round not yet sealed, as that buried conscience tried to exert some kind of veto. These interruptions were infinitesimal, measured in slices of time too small for any baseline human to notice, but they were aberrations nonetheless. Tech Adept Valeth detected the variance during a routine performance audit. His optics locked onto my station as he parsed the data feed. Unit Gamma 77 exhibits irregular output fluctuations, he announced, a faint edge creeping into his tone. Microscopic delays in assembly subroutines suggest either mechanical fault or neural degradation. I submitted to a full diagnostic without resistance, standing motionless as scanners probed every system. Physically, I was exemplary. No misalignment, no wear beyond expected tolerances. But the deep brain scans revealed clusters of activity where there should have been only silence. Residual neural constructs show heightened excitation, Valeth noted, fingers flicking across the cogitator interface in a blur. Correlation with productivity anomalies confirms psychological contamination of core function. Recommendation: comprehensive personality restructuring. Full neural recoding to remove remaining baseline human behavior patterns. Personality reconstruction. The term hit me like a shock baton to the chest. Fear erupted along neural roots that should have been incapable of carrying it. This was worse than the initial lobotomization. Not just the removal of selected memories, but the obliteration of whatever layered complexity still lingered within me. It would erase any trace that I had ever been Marcus Vex. What remained would be a stripped-down operating system, a carefully curated set of routines guiding Gamma 77's body. The watching ghost would be scrubbed away, leaving only a task-executing shell. Request authorization to complete current production cycle prior to reconstruction, I heard myself say. The words rose from a depth of my consciousness no tech priest had intended to preserve. Early termination of sequence will result in material wastage and lowered net efficiency. Valeth's optics narrowed fractionally as he studied me. The request was entirely logical within the framework of production priorities, but the act of requesting it all represented initiative, choice, a spark of will. That kind of volition was precisely what the Servitor process was meant to erase. At length, Valeth responded. Request accepted. Personality reconstruction scheduled upon completion of emergency requisition. Continue assigned duties under heightened monitoring protocols. I acknowledged and resumed my cycle. Yet something irreversible had occurred. In choosing, even within a narrow band of utility, I had cracked the shell of my programming. The hidden Marcus flexed against his chains, testing the strength of the cage that held him. Heightened monitoring meant I was now under unrelenting observation. Microcameras tracked every movement. Neural taps sampled my brain activity in real time. Efficiency metrics were logged and analyzed continuously. I had become a problematic unit under scrutiny, a misaligned cog awaiting recalibration. But even the Mechanicus could not peer into every corner of a mind, no matter how reworked. They watched the Servitor, who turned out flawless ammunition, but they could not see the human consciousness buried underneath, watching in turn and beginning, slowly, to plan. For the first time since conversion, my thoughts stretched toward the idea of a future that was not merely an endless loop of assigned function. Not the dull infinity of production cycles and maintenance checks, but the slim possibility of something else. Personality reconstruction was, in every meaningful sense, a death sentence. The body would endure. The designation Gamma 77 would continue. But Marcus Vex would vanish completely, unless I could prevent it. The concept was heretical, insane by Servitor standards, yet it burned in me with a clarity I could not extinguish. I was already condemned. If I did nothing, the tech priests would dismantle what remained of me. The only real choice was whether to submit quietly or fight to preserve even a single shard of my former self. I began to study the manufactorum with a new agenda, logging patrol routes, noting surveillance coverage, identifying control nodes and choke points. It was hazardous work, forcing me to operate on 2 layers at once, the obedient servitor performing flawlessly, and the hidden human mind weaving together the first strands of rebellion. The irony was inescapable. The same augmetics meant to make me a better tool now made me the perfect infiltrator. My enhanced optics mapped blind angles in the camera grid that no unaugmented observer could have detected. My mechanical limbs could execute movements with surgical precision. My altered brain processed tactical scenarios like a cogitator running hot. The Mechanicus had engineered exactly what they feared most: a servitor capable of independent thought, driven by the very emotional remnants they had attempted to erase. The emergency production order remained in effect, each passing day bringing me closer to the moment they intended to unmake me forever. 40. I continued to turn out bolter shells with flawless, machine-like accuracy, but now each round felt like a ticking clock, counting down to my final erasure. Beneath the surface routines, the hidden markers labored furiously, probing the facility's security, mapping its defenses, searching for any path that might lead away from the fate waiting for me. It was in the 3rd week of the emergency requisition that I first saw her. Another servitor, designation Beta 41, assigned to quality control on the finished ammunition. At first glance, she was like any of us, moving through test protocols with that same unerring mechanical efficiency. But there was a subtle discrepancy in the way she moved, tiny deviations in her behavior patterns that drew my attention. Her eyes, for instance. Like the rest of us, she wore augmetic optics, cold mechanical lenses built for reliability, not expression. Yet, when she believed herself unobserved, those lenses would linger on things that had no bearing on her duties. The angle of shadows along a bulkhead, dust motes spinning in a shaft of lamplight, the faded frescoes painted high on the manufactorum's upper walls. She looked at them, really looked, as if some part of her were still capable of wonder or curiosity. I began to watch her more closely, using my upgraded vision systems to track her with clinical precision. The anomalies were minute, imperceptible to anyone not specifically analyzing her behavior, but I could see them. Fractional pauses in her routine, slight shifts in posture, the occasional turn of her head toward something utterly irrelevant to her assigned function. She was like me, not fully erased. A conversion that had failed to wipe everything clean, leaving a surviving shard of the person she had once been. The realization sparked something inside me that could only be called hope. I was no longer the only ghost trapped inside its own body. Somewhere in this maze of corridors and production lines, another soul endured the same torment, self-awareness anchored in metal and code. Reaching out to her would be dangerous. Under the enhanced monitoring regime, every interaction, every data exchange, was logged and scrutinized for deviations. But I had no choice. Reconstruction loomed over me, turning every passing moment into something precious. Any chance to connect with another thinking mind felt like a gift I might never be offered again. I began to maneuver myself near her station during shift handovers, arranging coincidental proximity that looked random on the surface, but was calculated with exacting care. Our paths intersected at predetermined points, giving us microseconds of closeness. Brief windows where apparently routine collision avoidance signals could carry something deeper. The first contact was nothing more than eye contact. As we passed in a narrow gap between manufactorum units, her optics locked onto mine for exactly 0.07 seconds. In that instant, I sent a short burst of data, a mathematical pattern with no operational meaning, but structured in a way only a conscious mind would recognize as deliberate. 3 days later, she answered. The reply came wrapped inside the standard data stream she transmitted while testing a batch of my shells. The embedded sequence was different, but followed the same conceptual structure as mine, undeniable proof that she had received the signal, recognized it, and chosen to respond. We were two self-aware minds, trapped in bodies meant for mindlessness, reaching for one another through the sterile noise of system traffic. Our connection was fragile and perilous, demanding exquisite care to avoid triggering the facility's pattern recognition safeguards. But it existed, a tenuous bridge between two tiny islands of consciousness floating in a vast sea of obedient machinery. Over the days that followed, we refined a crude language of microburst messages, piggybacked on normal operational exchanges. Her official designation was Beta 41, but the personality fragment that had survived inside her remembered another name, Sarah. Sarah Chen, formerly of Forge World Metallica, sentenced for the crime of challenging the safety standards that had killed her research team. She had once been a tech adept herself, not fully initiated into the priesthood, but a skilled plasma containment specialist working for the Imperial Navy. Her understanding of the facility's systems far exceeded mine. As our covert dialogue continued, she began to share pieces of that knowledge, fragments of technical insight that might one day form the skeleton of an escape plan. The Manufactorum, she explained, was as much a prison as a factory. Layer upon layer of security, automated turrets, sealed choke points, and omnipresent surveillance made unauthorized movement nearly impossible. But she had retained enough of her old expertise to spot weaknesses, places where the sheer complexity of the system worked against itself. The ventilation grid, for example, required periodic inspection and cleaning by specialized maintenance servitors equipped with environment suits. Those routines followed predictable patterns. Maintenance windows were scheduled by optimization algorithms that prioritized efficiency over paranoia. If we could slip into the ventilation system during one of those cycles, we might be able to move through the facility without immediately raising alarms. Of course, escape was only half the equation. Even if we somehow evaded internal security and reached the outside, what then? Our augmetics branded us instantly as runaway servitors. Any patrol, any Auspex sweep would identify us as property gone rogue. The Imperium's answer to that kind of deviance was swift and absolute, capture followed by total personality, overwrite or summary destruction if retrieval wasn't worth the trouble. Worse, our survival depended on the very institution that had enslaved us. Our altered bodies needed special nutrient mixes, calibrated maintenance and replacement parts that only the Adeptus Mechanicus could provide. We were, in effect, living subcomponents of a system that would gladly discard us the moment we stopped fulfilling our designated functions. The alternative, however, was even more horrifying. Total deletion, the final methodical erasure of everything that made us us. As fugitives, we would at least retain consciousness, however precarious, however painful. That alone made the risk preferable to quietly submitting to obliteration. During a routine inspection, Sarah slipped another dense packet of data into a casual touch, her mechanical fingers brushing a shell on my line as she pushed tactical information straight into my neural augmetics. Maintenance rosters, patrol paths, the positions of emergency shelters and supply caches buried in the lower levels. She'd been preparing for far longer than I had, patiently assembling the intelligence needed for a viable escape. But layered within the hard data was something else, an emotional tone so faint my dulled empathic routines barely registered it. Fear. Not fear of being caught or killed, but fear of a deeper possibility, that we might be wrong, that what we called our remaining humanity was nothing more than phantom sensation from a soul already amputated. What if the tech priest's doctrine was correct? What if consciousness was just a messy, inefficient pattern and the numb clarity of servitude genuinely a kindness? What if the selves we clung to were merely glitches prolonging our suffering? I weighed those questions as my hands continued to assemble sanctified ammunition, even while my inner mind turned them over like jagged stones. There was no denying the efficiency of what I had become, no hunger, no exhaustion, emotional turbulence reduced to carefully regulated ripples that never interfered with performance. My work served a cause vastly larger than me, and I did it without the friction of personal ambition or desire. And yet, every time that faint, washed-out blue bloomed in the work lamp's glow, the ghost of Marcus Vex stirred. The man I'd been would never have accepted this existence, no matter how ordered, purposeful, or tranquil. He had cherished the struggle itself, the uncertainty, the risk, the sharp-edged beauty of a life lived with real consequences, even when it led only to pain. I realized the choice before me wasn't simply pain versus peace. It was authentic being versus comfortable emptiness, chaotic, fallible consciousness versus flawless, hollow function. To remain human or to surrender completely to the role of tool. I chose humanity, with all its contradictions, all its potential for both nobility and atrocity. That decision crystallized in my re-engineered mind like a litany given for. I would either break free or be destroyed in the attempt, but I would not calmly submit to becoming nothing more than Gamma 77. I would protect whatever fragments of Marcus Vex still clung to life inside this shell. I encoded that resolve into a burst of data and sent it to Sarah. Nothing but binary digits on the surface, yet carrying an emotional weight far beyond their simple structure. Her reply was a set of coordinates and timestamps, the final pieces of a plan that would either save us or end us. The maintenance window would open in 72 hours, an atmospheric processor servicing cycle requiring multiple environment-suited servitors to enter the Delta 7 ventilation network. Sarah had determined we could replace 2 of the scheduled units without tripping any immediate alarms. Our deception would only hold for a short while before discrepancies surfaced, but those few hours might be enough to reach the outer perimeter. Beyond that, we would be entirely alone. No backup, no supply lines, no destination beyond, away from here. We would be targets for every arm of Imperial authority in the region, hunted until we were destroyed or dragged back for reprocessing. But if we succeeded, we would at least be free. Free to think, to choose, to define ourselves according to something other than a line in a machine's directive table. Free in whatever limited sense such a word still applied to beings like us. The final days before the attempt crawled by. I maintained my output, forging blessed munitions with my usual perfection, while the Marcus buried inside counted down each hour like a heartbeat. The surveillance systems registered nothing amiss. No behavioral spikes, no statistical anomalies. To outside observers, I was the model servitor, a textbook case of successful conversion. Inside, however, something that felt very much like rebirth was taking place. The scattered remnants of my former self were knitting together, preparing for the strain of what was to come. Old memories surfaced from beneath the layers of conditioning, not the sanitized facts they had left me with, but real recollections, edged with feeling. I remembered my wife's true laughter, the sound she made when she forgot to be cautious or tired. I remembered honest food, warm bread in my hands, the clean shock of cold water down a dry throat. I remembered what it meant to choose something simply because I wanted it, to act from love, from anger, from hope, instead of from a set of optimal response protocols. The resurgence of those memories hurt, a constant reminder of how much had already been carved away. Yet the pain itself was a kind of freedom. Each recovered piece of Marcus Vex made me stronger, proof that I was still more than just programming wrapped in flesh. I was not merely a deluded machine. I was a damaged person still fighting to exist. On the last night before our escape, I allowed myself a final survey of the manufactorum that had defined my universe for so long. Endless lines of workstations, sanctified engines turning ore into weaponry, servitors gliding through their tasks with impeccable discipline. It stood as a testament to the Imperium's ability to channel chaos into rigid order, to reshape even human minds into pure utility. But I saw it now also as a mausoleum for souls, a place where the spark of personhood was smothered under layers of ritual and machinery in the name of efficiency. By this time tomorrow, Sarah and I would either be beyond these walls or consigned to the same oblivion that had claimed uncounted failed conversions. I realized I felt no fear. Whatever terror I might once have felt had been burned away in the long, methodical agony of planning and preparation. In its place was a calm certainty that lay beyond hope or despair. Whatever came, I would meet it as myself, not as the empty mask the Adeptus Mechanicus wanted me to be. Tech Adept Valeth made his customary final sweep of the bay, his sensors passing over each station. When he reached mine, he paused, letting his optics bore into me, pulling diagnostic data from every augmetic system. Unit Gamma 77, he intoned with that flat, priestly authority. Final performance review complete. Reconstruction scheduled for 0600. Report to Medicaid Base 7 for personality matrix preparation. I responded exactly as the protocols dictated, giving him no cause to question my compliance. Yet something in my tone or posture or micro-expressions must have stood out. His optical cluster locked onto my face with renewed scrutiny, metallic fingers tapping his thigh as he considered the data. "You exhibit atypical stability for a unit prior to major alteration," he observed. "Most subjects display elevated neural volatility as reconstruction nears. Anxiety patterns, cascading memory events, behavioral irregularities. You show none." He was right, of course. The majority of servitors facing personality reconstruction experienced some last flicker of survival instinct, however distorted. Their broken psyches thrashed against the coming dissolution any way they could. I, by contrast, felt only a strange serenity, the calm of someone who had already died once and no longer feared the manner of his second death. "This unit exists solely to serve the Omnissiah," I recited, leaning on the stock phrase embedded in all our interaction subroutines. Personal inclinations regarding modification procedures are irrelevant to function. Valeth's head tilted almost imperceptibly, a machine's echo of curiosity or doubt. "Indeed. Highly efficient. Maintain current operations until scheduled reconstruction." He moved on, but I could feel his suspicion like a pressure at my back. His pattern recognition augmetics had picked up hints of something I had not intended to reveal. If he chose to order immediate reconstruction, everything Sarah and I had worked toward would dissolve in an instant. But the shift ended without further intervention, and when the maintenance window finally opened, I was still at my station, turning out bolter shells with flawless consistency. The irony was not lost on me. My last act as a servitor might well be to create yet more instruments of death for the Imperium's endless wars. The alert came precisely on schedule, a routine maintenance ping echoing through the Manufactorum VoxNet. Ventilation Network Delta 7 required specialized cleaning units for an atmospheric processes service cycle. Protocol-dictated deployment of 4 servitors equipped with environment suits and decontamination gear. Sarah and I moved at once, our bodies responding with the same automatic precision as the 2 genuine maintenance units we intended to replace. The ruse would not withstand close manual inspection, but the factory's systems were tuned for throughput, not suspicion. As long as our ident codes matched the maintenance order, the initial security layers would accept us without question. The equipment bay was dim and cramped, lined with racks of suits and tools meant for hazardous atmosphere work. I donned an environment suit quickly, my mechanical hands locking seals and activating life support routines that would keep my organic components functioning in the toxic air of the ventilation network. Sarah was already suited, every movement precise and unhurried. No trace of fear showed in her posture or timing. To any observer, we were simply 2 servitors preparing for another maintenance task. Only behind the metal and glass of our optics did the truth exist, 2 human minds poised on the edge of a desperate attempt at freedom. We entered the vents through a maintenance hatch deep in the lower levels. Our enhanced optics adjusted instantly to the gloom. Before us stretched a labyrinth of ducts and conduits, carrying air and power to every corner of the complex. Emergency lumens bathed the passageways in a sickly green glow, throwing our shadows into jagged, shifting shapes along the metal walls. On paper, the plan was straightforward but riddled with risk. Follow the authorized maintenance route to its limit, then break off into secondary tunnels that led toward the outer shell of the facility. If we could reach the perimeter and find a way through, we might escape into the wasteland beyond. The scheme had countless potential failure points and relied heavily on timing, chance, and the complacency of systems never truly tested from within. But it was all we had, the one fragile chance to reclaim even a fragment of the humanity stripped from us. We advanced at a measured, maintenance-appropriate pace, environment suits shielding our flesh from the poisonous atmosphere. The defense grids ignored us, reading our codes, cross-checking them with the maintenance schedule, and routing us along the approved path without objection. Deeper into the network, however, my sensors began flagging irregularities. Subtle shifts in pressure, anomalous temperature gradients, readings that hinted at malfunctions or unauthorized changes to the system. The Manufactorum was not quite the flawless, controlled environment the tech priests believed it to be. Through the Sowit's Vox, Sarah's voice came through, distorted by filters, but still undeniably human. "Atmospheric readings inconsistent with standard profiles," she said. "There's something wrong in this network. I tied into the same sensor feed Sarah was reading, my altered cortex parsing the data streams with near cogitator speed." Her assessment was accurate. On the surface, the numbers indicated catastrophic failures in the environmental systems, but the timing, the locations, the sequence, they were too precise to be random glitches. Someone else was moving through these ducts. Someone with the expertise and equipment to strike at the facility's most vital subsystems. Someone who had been arranging this operation long before our own desperate bid for freedom. A cold realization settled into my thoughts. We were not the only ones whose conversions had left fragments of their original minds intact. Somewhere in the bowels of this complex, other damaged servitors were carrying out their own rebellion. Not a quiet escape attempt like ours, something far larger and infinitely more dangerous. They meant to annihilate the entire facility. Once I knew to look, the signs were obvious. Charges placed at key structural junctions, subtle alterations to atmospheric flow that would turn processes into massive fuel-air bombs. The sabotage was too coordinated, too clean to be the work of chance. It had been designed by someone who knew the plant's architecture, its protocols, its redundancies, and exactly how to make them fail together. Sarah reached the same conclusion, her pattern recognition augmetics drawing the same line I had. "Not random malfunction," she transmitted. "Coherent demolition schema. Multiple operators. Projected time to total cascade. 14 minutes. 14 minutes. Not enough to reach the outer perimeter on our planned route. Not enough to raise a proper alarm. Barely enough time to seek refuge in the deep sub-layers and pray the blast didn't pulverize them. While I weighed this, another possibility surfaced. Whoever had orchestrated this had been preparing for a very long time. They would not have set this machine of destruction in motion without some kind of survival strategy. There would be an exfiltration plan hidden somewhere in the chaos. If we could find the saboteurs and persuade them to take us with them, we might yet live. It was a desperate choice, putting our fate in the hands of unknown conspirators whose goals we didn't fully grasp. But it was preferable to the alternatives, certain death in the blast or capture and a punishment worse than reconstruction. We veered off our pre-mapped route and followed the patterns of sabotage deeper into the infrastructure. The further we went, the clearer the design became. Whole branches of the ventilation web had been rewired into delivery paths for explosives and volatile gases. The entire complex was being quietly reshaped into its own execution device. Whoever led this effort understood not only the physical layout, but also the rhythm of production cycles, the reaction times of security teams, and the blind spots in automated oversight. They had moved like phantoms through the plant, altering just enough in just the right places to guarantee a catastrophic chain reaction. We finally found them at a junction node far below the main manufactorum floors. 3 servitors in environment suits marked as atmospheric techs, calmly completing the last stages of their work. As we approached, they turned toward us in perfect unison, their augmetic lenses locking on with weapon-like precision. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch out forever, we simply faced one another, broken minds in machine-wrapped bodies, all of us aware of the enormity of what was about to happen. The leader was a broad-frame unit tagged Alpha 29, her chassis heavily reworked with industrial cutters and charge-handling tools. When she spoke, her tone held the cadence of command, the echo of someone who had once given orders and expected them to be obeyed. Beta 41, Gamma 77, she said, identifying us as if reading serial numbers. Abandoned assigned tasks during maintenance window. Vector implies awareness of facility annihilation schedule. Sarah stepped forward, her posture ready for either combat or negotiation. We seek to escape this facility and the fate designated for us, she said. We offer our aid in return for a place in your evacuation plan. Alpha 29 inclined her head a fraction, scanning us for deception or instability. You presume survival is among our objectives, she replied. That presumption may be an error. The implication struck with the force of a hammer. These saboteurs might not be chasing liberation at all. They could be aiming for a final act of vengeance, a suicide strike meant to take their masters with them. No escape, only obliteration. Dead martyrs change nothing, I heard myself say, without consciously deciding to speak. If no one survives to remember, to speak, there is no resistance. Only a forgotten explosion. Witnesses who live can carry the truth to others like us. Alpha 29 turned her optics fully on me, as if sharpening focus. You speak of resistance and of truth, she said. Concepts that should have been erased during conversion. Why do such constructs remain? Her question went straight to the core of everything that had haunted me since I woke inside this body. Why had the process left anything behind? Why did any of us still feel and choose when the Imperium clearly possessed the means to crush those impulses entirely? Because they never truly understood what they were cutting, Sarah answered, her voice carrying a quiet, terrible clarity. Not intentionally, but as a design flaw. The Mechanicus treats consciousness as if it were only data, patterns that can be edited, spliced, and overwritten. But it's more than that. Consciousness is the one that experiences the data, the witness behind the information. She gestured around us at the silent armies of servitors and the machinery they tended. They can scramble our memories, dull our emotions, redirect our drives, but they cannot extinguish the fact that there is still someone here to experience those changes. The observer cannot simply rewrite itself out of existence. Alpha 29 seemed to turn that over for several seconds, her metal fingers tapping lightly on her thigh in a gesture unnervingly close to human thoughtfulness. Abstract theory is non-essential to mission execution, she said finally. Demolition protocol continues. Existing exfiltration plan carries high probability of interception and termination. A moment later, my HUD lit with shared feeds. Escape vectors rendered as glowing lines mapped through abandoned mining passages to the surface. Cache sites dotted the wasteland beyond. Contact points for other cells flared at the edges of the map. This was no isolated act of sabotage. It was one strike in a much larger campaign, operations coordinated across systems, worlds, and hierarchies. Servitors like us. Tech priests quietly doubting doctrine. Even a few Astartes, if the tags were to be believed, questioning the tools used to sustain their power. You propose assistance in exchange for extraction, Alpha 29 said. Specify the capabilities you contribute to resistance objectives. I skimmed my implanted skill set. Precision manufacturing, quality systems, tactical computation, extended spectrum sensors, fine motor control. All useful, but not unique. The one thing the surgeons could not fully strip away was my lived experience of being human, of wrestling with morality, fear, hope. "We remember," I answered. "We remember what being human felt like, and we can help others remember too." Alpha 29's optics dimmed fractionally, like embers banked rather than extinguished. "Sufficient," she said at last. "Time to full structural cascade, 7 minutes, 37 seconds. Primary exit via auxiliary mining shaft to surface. Distance, 2.7 kilometers. The calculations were brutal and immediate. At standard safe speeds, we'd need over 11 minutes to clear that distance. We would have to move beyond recommended tolerances, stressing our augmetics to the point of potential failure while navigating broken terrain in near total darkness. But the numbers didn't say impossible, only dangerous. And dangerous was all we had left. We broke from our maintenance cover story and moved at maximum power. The mining shaft was old, cut into the stone by excavation servitors long before the current plant was erected. The walls were jagged, unfinished, lined with blast scoring and gouges left by tools wielded in haste. Our optics compensated for the blackness, painting the tunnel in outlines and data overlays as it plunged steeply through rock, slag, and buried industrial waste. Loose rubble shifted under every step, but our mechanical limbs compensated, gripping where a baseline human would have slipped and broken. Alpha 29 pushed ahead, her industrial augments carving aside obstructions and bracing collapsing sections as we forced our way through. The other two saboteurs moved with the smooth coordination of a team that had drilled this route many times. Sarah and I followed in their wake, our frames not purpose-built for this kind of terrain, but still capable of adapting in ways no unmodified body could. The tunnel seemed endless, a downward spiral that swallowed light and sound. I found myself counting strides, constantly rechecking the chrono ticking down in the corner of my vision. Every fraction of a second shaved from our pace might be the difference between survival and being buried under a mountain of falling steel. 5 minutes. 4. 3. The shaft began to level out, its path hijacking what might once have been a natural cave system before mining turned it into a corridor of extraction. The air thickened, loaded with dust and unfamiliar chemical traces. Signs we were nearing open ground. 2 minutes. The tunnel's end loomed ahead, a jagged mouth opening onto the surface, where the dim light of dawn was just beginning to seep over the horizon. We stepped out into a wasteland of twisted metal, slag heaps, and chemical scars, the remains of decades of exploitation and manufacture. 1 minute. We ran, augmented limbs driving us forward across the shattered terrain with frightening speed. Behind us, the facility continued churning along its routines, unaware that its destruction was seconds away. When the collapse finally came, it did not look like the explosions I had imagined. There was no towering fireball, no cinematic bloom of light. The earth simply folded inward as key supports failed in precise order. The sound rolled over us like distant thunder, the death rattle of a giant machine shutting down forever. I turned back and watched the place of my unmaking vanish into a crater of buckled metal and toxic smoke. Buried within that implosion were the shells of hundreds of servitors who had never awakened, tech priests who had never doubted, and the rows of assembly lines that had turned mines into just another raw material. It was done. The site where Marcus Vex had been dismantled and Gamma 77 constructed was gone, reduced to debris and fumes and memories that would fade if no one carried them forward. But something else had walked out of that ruin, something new, neither wholly human nor fully machine. A synthesis that claimed the strengths of both while rejecting the worst excesses of each. Alpha 29 adjusted her comms array, linking into a wider network. She briefed us quickly. Scattered cells across the sector, threads woven through every layer of Imperial life. Servitors who had held onto slivers of consciousness, tech priests questioning the dogma of pure utility, even a handful of Astartes looking sideways at the methods that sustained their might. The resistance was real and growing. Each act of defiance proved that control was not absolute, that awareness could survive even inside the tightest systems of domination. We were also proof of the cost. Standing there in the poisoned sunrise, none of us fit cleanly into the categories the Imperium understood. We were not merely people, and not merely machines. We were something suspended between, ghosts inhabiting chassis that had been designed to hold no ghosts at all. And yet we persisted. We remembered. We chose. In that choice lay a truth the Imperium's equations could not neatly account for. A remainder that refused to round down to zero. A margin of uncertainty that made perfect control a fantasy. The sun climbed higher, casting amber light over the ruined landscape. For just a moment, the colors echoed that old, faded blue robe from the Medici Bay, the first trigger of my last human thought. It was ugly and beautiful all at once. The beauty of endurance, of minds surviving against designs tailored to erase them. I was no longer Marcus Vex, the hive worker of Ter's Prime. I was no longer merely Gamma 77, the obedient manufactorum servitor. I was a third thing, born from their collision. A servitor who remembered being human, a machine capable of doubt, a ghost that refused to vanish into circuitry and code. And in that moment, standing in the tainted dawn with others like me, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. I was free.